Paradox. That single word captures the maddening dance you've been trapped in with someone who runs the moment your hearts begin to synchronize. You've experienced the hidden reason your avoidant pulls away right when you get close, haven't you? That moment when intimacy blooms and suddenly, inexplicably, they vanish like morning mist. It's not cruelty, though it feels like it. It's not indifference, though it appears so. It's something far more complex and deeply human, a psychological labyrinth where love becomes the very thing that triggers escape. I've spent decades observing the intricate choreography of human relationships, and I can tell you this: the avoidant partner isn't running from you. They're running from a mirror that reflects their deepest fears about themselves. When you draw close, when vulnerability becomes inevitable, their mind performs an extraordinary feat of self-deception. They convince themselves they can read your thoughts, predict your disappointment, and see the inevitable rejection lurking behind your loving gaze. This phenomenon has a name: the illusion of asymmetric insight, and it's destroying more relationships than infidelity ever could. Picture this scenario. You've been building something beautiful together. Late-night conversations that stretch until dawn, shared silences that speak volumes, touches that linger with unspoken promises. Then, without warning, they become distant. Text messages grow shorter. Plans get cancelled. The warmth in their eyes dims to polite courtesy. You're left wondering what you did wrong, replaying every interaction like a detective searching for clues at a crime scene where no crime was committed. But here's what's truly happening in their mind during those precious moments of closeness. They're not experiencing the joy you feel. Instead, their brain is running a different program entirely. They're convinced they can see through your expressions to the disappointment they believe is inevitable. They're certain they understand your motivations better than you do. They're reading rejection into every pause, every glance, every breath you take. This isn't intuition, it's projection dressed up as insight. The tragedy is that they genuinely believe they're protecting both of you from future pain. In their mind, they're being pragmatic, even noble. They think they're saving you from the disappointment of discovering who they really are and saving themselves from the agony of watching love transform into regret. But this perceived insight is an illusion, a cognitive trap that keeps them imprisoned in patterns of isolation. Today, I'm going to take you inside this psychological maze. We'll explore not just what happens when your avoidant partner pulls away, but why their mind tricks them into believing it's necessary. More importantly, I'll show you how to recognize these patterns, understand the fears driving them, and develop strategies that can help break this cycle of approach and retreat. We'll delve into the negativity bias that makes them focus on potential problems rather than present joy, and examine how the illusion of asymmetric insight convinces them they're mind readers when they're actually mind prisoners. This isn't about fixing someone who's broken. Avoidant individuals aren't damaged goods waiting for repair. This is about understanding a fundamentally different way of experiencing intimacy, one shaped by early experiences that taught them love comes with conditions and closeness leads to pain. When you understand the mechanism, you can learn to work with it rather than against it. You can become fluent in a different language of love, one that speaks in actions rather than words, in consistency rather than intensity, in patience rather than pursuit. The dance doesn't have to end in separation. The paradox can be resolved. But first, you need to see the invisible forces at play, the fears that masquerade as certainties, and the protection mechanisms that have become prisons. Let me tell you a story about two people who nearly lost each other to these very patterns, and how understanding changed everything. There once lived a woman named Catherine, a successful architect who could design beautiful spaces for others, but struggled to create emotional space for herself. She had mastered the art of intimacy in measured doses, close enough to feel connection, distant enough to maintain control. Her relationships followed a predictable pattern: attraction, pursuit, growing closeness, then an inevitable retreat when things became too real, too vulnerable, too permanent. Catherine met Marcus at a gallery opening, drawn to his quiet intensity and the way he spoke about art as if it were alive. Their early dates were magical: long walks through the city, conversations that revealed layers of depth, a growing sense that they understood each other in ways that felt rare and precious. Marcus was patient in a way that surprised her, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, never demanding declarations or commitments. For the first time in years, Catherine felt safe enough to let someone closer to her carefully guarded heart. But as summer turned to autumn, something shifted. The closer they became, the more Catherine found herself analyzing Marcus's every expression, every word, every gesture. When he smiled after she shared a childhood memory, she was convinced she saw pity rather than tenderness. When he was quiet during dinner, she interpreted his thoughtfulness as boredom. When he suggested meeting her friends, she heard obligation rather than genuine interest. Her mind had become a prosecutor, building a case against his love with evidence only she could see. The breaking point came on a perfect October evening. They had spent the day exploring a farmer's market, laughing over terrible pumpkin jokes and sharing bites of warm apple cider donuts. Back at her apartment, as golden light filtered through the windows and Marcus helped her arrange the flowers they'd bought, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood: complete contentment. The moment was so beautiful, so achingly perfect, that her mind immediately began to dissect it. She watched Marcus's face as he concentrated on the flower arrangement and convinced herself she could see his thoughts. He's realizing I'm not as interesting as he thought. Look how forced his smile is. He's being polite, but he's probably thinking about how to end this gracefully. He's younger than me. What does he really want with someone like me? I'm fooling myself if I think this is real. None of these thoughts were based on anything Marcus had said or done. They were projections, fears dressed up as insights. But to Catherine, they felt as real as the flowers in her hands. She became quiet, then distant, then actively cold. When Marcus asked what was wrong, she told him she thought they were moving too fast, that maybe they should take a break. The confusion and hurt in his eyes only confirmed her suspicions. See, she thought, he's relieved I'm giving him an out. But Marcus wasn't relieved. He was devastated. The day had been perfect for him too, and he'd been planning to tell Catherine he was falling in love with her. Her sudden withdrawal felt like a punishment for a crime he couldn't identify. He respected her wishes and pulled back, but inside he was reeling, wondering what he'd missed, what he'd done wrong. The beautiful thing they'd been building crumbled in the space of a single evening, destroyed by fears that existed only in Catherine's imagination. This is the cruel irony of the illusion of asymmetric insight. The closer someone gets to breaking through an avoidant person's walls, the more convinced the avoidant becomes that they can see the other person's true feelings. They believe they have special insight into their partner's mind, that they can detect the subtle signs of disappointment, the hidden motivations, the inevitable rejection. But this supposed insight is actually a blindness, an inability to see anything but their own fears reflected back at them. What Catherine didn't understand was that her brain was being hijacked by negativity bias, the evolutionary quirk that makes humans pay more attention to potential threats than to actual pleasures. In prehistoric times, this bias kept us alive by making us hypervigilant to danger. But in modern relationships, it becomes a saboteur, making us focus on imaginary problems while ignoring genuine affection. Every neutral expression becomes evidence of dissatisfaction. Every moment of natural human complexity becomes proof of impending rejection. Marcus, meanwhile, was experiencing his own confusion. He genuinely cared for Catherine and had been nothing but authentic in his feelings, yet she seemed convinced he was hiding something. Her accusations of insincerity felt like being blamed for crimes he'd never committed. He began to doubt his own perceptions, wondering if he really was as transparent as he believed, if there were hidden motivations in his actions that even he couldn't see. This is another cruel aspect of the pattern. It makes both partners question their own reality. The story could have ended there, with both of them walking away wounded and confused. But 3 months later, Catherine found herself in therapy, trying to understand why every relationship followed the same destructive pattern. Her therapist introduced her to the concepts we're discussing today, the illusion of asymmetric insight and negativity bias. For the first time, Catherine began to see that her supposed ability to read people's minds was actually a projection of her own fears. She realized that when she looked at Marcus during their perfect day, she wasn't seeing his thoughts. She was seeing her own terror of being truly known and potentially rejected. Her mind had created a narrative of his disappointment to justify her own fear of vulnerability. The insight she thought she had into his feelings was actually blindness to his actual expressions of care and affection. Understanding the mechanism didn't immediately fix the pattern, but it gave Catherine a new perspective. She began to catch herself in the act of mind reading, to question whether her interpretations of others' behaviors were based on evidence or on fear. She started to distinguish between actual red flags and the false alarms her negativity bias was constantly triggering. Most importantly, she began to understand that her tendency to pull away wasn't protecting anyone. It was just perpetuating a cycle of loneliness that had started long before Marcus entered her life. Now that we understand the psychological mechanisms at play, let's explore how to work with them rather than against them. The first and most crucial step is developing what I call mindful skepticism, the practice of questioning your own certainties about what your partner is thinking or feeling. When you find yourself convinced you know what's going on in their mind, pause and ask yourself, am I responding to what's actually happening or to what I fear might be happening? This isn't about dismissing your intuition entirely. Sometimes we do pick up on subtle cues that something is amiss, but there's a difference between genuine intuition and projection-based assumption. Genuine intuition is usually calm and observational. I notice they seem distracted tonight. Projection-based assumption is emotional and definitive. I can tell they're getting tired of me. Learning to distinguish between these two requires practice and honest self-reflection. The second step is what I call evidence-based reality testing, when your mind starts constructing stories about your partner's hidden thoughts or feelings. Demand evidence, not interpretations, not hunches, not the way someone's mouth curved or didn't curve, but actual concrete evidence. Has your partner explicitly expressed dissatisfaction? Have their actions consistently contradicted their words? Are there objective changes in how they treat you, or are you reading disappointment into normal human complexity? This process requires you to become a detective of your own assumptions. Write down what you think you're seeing, then write down the actual evidence that supports that interpretation. You'll often discover that your fears have been building elaborate narratives on foundations of sand. A delayed text response becomes evidence of waning interest. A thoughtful pause becomes proof of boredom. Natural human variability in mood and energy becomes confirmation of your deepest fears. The third crucial step is developing what researchers call charitable interpretation, the practice of giving your partner the benefit of the doubt when their behavior is ambiguous. Instead of automatically assuming the worst-case scenario, try to imagine the most generous explanation for their actions. If they seem distant, could they be stressed about work rather than losing interest in you? If they're less talkative than usual, could they be processing something rather than hiding dissatisfaction? This doesn't mean being naive or ignoring real red flags, but rather not turning every moment of human imperfection into evidence of rejection. Charitable interpretation is particularly challenging for people with avoidant patterns because it requires vulnerability. You have to risk being wrong about potential threats. But it's essential for breaking the cycle of preemptive withdrawal. When you consistently interpret ambiguous signals in the most positive, reasonable way, you create space for actual intimacy to develop rather than constantly defending against imaginary attacks. The fourth step involves what I call delayed response protocol. When you feel the urge to pull away or create distance, don't act on it immediately. Instead, give yourself 48 hours to sit with the feeling and examine it. Often, what feels like urgent self-protection is actually just fear masquerading as wisdom. Use this time to apply the previous steps. Question your certainties, examine your evidence, practice charitable interpretation. You'll be amazed how many insights about your partner's feelings dissolve under careful examination. During this 48-hour window, also pay attention to your body's responses. Fear-based insights often come with physical tension, racing thoughts, and a sense of urgency. Genuine intuition tends to be calmer and more grounded. Your body can be a valuable ally in distinguishing between real concerns and projected fears, but only if you learn to listen to it carefully rather than react immediately to every surge of anxiety. The fifth step is perhaps the most challenging, learning to communicate your fears directly instead of acting them out through withdrawal. When you notice yourself wanting to pull away, try sharing the fear itself rather than creating distance. Instead of becoming cold and distant, say something like, "I'm feeling scared that I'm boring you, and I'm not sure if that's based on something real or just my own insecurity." This approach does two things. It gives your partner a chance to reassure you and address any real concerns, and it prevents you from solving imaginary problems with real distance. This kind of direct communication feels terrifyingly vulnerable at first, especially for people with avoidant patterns. It goes against every instinct that says safety lies in emotional self-sufficiency. But it's the only way to test whether your fears are based in reality or in projection. Most of the time, you'll discover that your partner had no idea you were struggling with these concerns, and that their actual feelings are quite different from what you imagined. The final step in this process is developing what I call present moment anchoring. Instead of letting your mind spin stories about future disappointment or hidden dissatisfaction, practice returning to what's actually happening right now. What do you see in your partner's face when you really look without the filter of fear? What are they actually saying, not what you think they mean? How are they actually treating you, not how you imagine they might treat you in the future? This present moment focus is crucial because most avoidant withdrawal happens in response to imagined future scenarios rather than current reality. Your mind fast forwards to potential rejection, imagined disappointment, or projected abandonment. But relationships exist in the present moment, built through thousands of small interactions happening right now. When you anchor yourself in current reality instead of projected fears, you often discover that the present moment is actually quite safe and loving. Remember that changing these patterns is not about forcing yourself to trust everyone or ignoring legitimate concerns about compatibility. It's about learning to distinguish between real relationship issues and the phantom problems created by your own fear. Real issues can be discussed, negotiated, and often resolved. Phantom problems just create distance and prevent the very intimacy that could heal the original wounds driving your avoidance. The transformation doesn't happen overnight. Catherine didn't immediately become comfortable with vulnerability, and her relationship with Marcus required rebuilding trust that had been damaged by her withdrawal. But understanding the mechanism gave them both a framework for navigating future moments when her fears threatened to create distance. When Catherine felt the familiar urge to pull away, she learned to pause and examine whether she was responding to Marcus's actual behavior or to her own projections. Marcus, for his part, learned to recognize the signs of Catherine's internal struggle and offer reassurance without taking her fears personally. He understood that her tendency to withdraw wasn't about his worth as a partner, but about patterns formed long before they met. This knowledge allowed him to remain consistent and patient during moments when Catherine's fear made her seem distant or cold. The journey towards secure attachment isn't about perfection, it's about awareness. It's about catching yourself in the act of mind reading and choosing to stay present instead of fleeing into familiar loneliness. It's about risking the vulnerability of being wrong about your fears in order to discover the truth about your partner's actual feelings. Most importantly, it's about understanding that the very intimacy that triggers your flight response is also the only thing that can heal the wounds driving your avoidance. Your avoidant partner isn't broken, and neither are you if you recognize these patterns in yourself. You're simply people whose early experiences taught you that love comes with conditions and closeness leads to pain. But those early lessons, while they may have been necessary survival strategies at the time, don't have to govern your adult relationships. You can learn new patterns, develop new responses, and create the secure connections your heart has always craved. The next time you feel that familiar urge to pull away just as things are getting good, remember Catherine's story. Remember that what feels like insight might be illusion. What seems like protection might be self-sabotage. Take that 48-hour pause. Question your certainties. Look for evidence rather than assumptions. Practice charitable interpretation. And most courageously of all, share your fears instead of acting them out through distance. The paradox of avoidant attachment can be resolved, but it requires the very vulnerability that feels most dangerous. It requires staying present when everything in you wants to flee. It requires trusting that the person reaching toward you might actually want to be there, that their love might be genuine, that their interest might last. This trust isn't naive, it's revolutionary. It's the choice to build intimacy on actual evidence rather than imagined threats. Your heart knows the difference between real danger and phantom fears, but you have to be still enough to listen. The same sensitivity that makes you hyper-aware of potential rejection can also attune you to genuine love, but only if you learn to distinguish between the two. The person who truly cares for you won't be driven away by your honest struggles with trust and vulnerability. They'll meet your courage with their own, creating the safety you need to finally let down your guard. Stop running from the very intimacy that could heal you. Stop solving problems that exist only in your imagination. Start building relationships on the foundation of present reality rather than projected fears. The love you're seeking isn't found in the safety of distance. It's discovered in the brave choice to stay close even when everything in you wants to flee. That's where transformation happens. That's where healing begins. That's where your heart finally finds the home it's been searching for all along.
If you believe this video might help someone dear to you, share it with them. A small gesture on your part could mean the world to a friend in need.